Hello, I'm Ron Duncan Hart of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and I'd like to welcome you to this program today with Professor Debra Caplan from Baruch College in the City University of New York. The I would also like to thank Peter Zanden and Lonnie Zarum for sponsoring this program today in honor of Paul Golding and Bonnie Ellinger and their contributions to the community and also to this program. We thank you very much. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Caplan, a theater scholar, composer, lyricist, and theater educator who, in her own words, says she tells stories about the past in order to better understand the present. Her research focuses on Yiddish theater and drama, uh, theatrical travel, artistic networks, and immigrant theater. Her first book, which we will hear a little bit more about today, is The Yiddish Empire. Let me see, I get it right. The Yiddish Empire. And it received awards from the Theater Library Association, Modern Language Association, and her second book, the Dybbuk Century, which I'll show you in just a minute, um, is the book to read if you want to read more about the Dybbuk. And she did that co-edited with Rachel Merrill Moss, and we'll be looking forward to hearing more about that today. Her writing has appeared widely in journals from the Theater Survey to the American Theater Magazine. She's currently working on a new biography of the legendary Yiddish performer Mali Picon, which I think we'll all enjoy looking forward to. She is also a composer, lyricist, translator, and director of theater, and she's currently working on a new musical about the members of the Paper Brigade. Her dramatic work has appeared at Target Margin Theater, the Baruch Performing Arts Center, CUNY's Center for the Humanities, Harvard University, the Yiddish Book Center, and the National Yiddish Theater Folksbein. She is also the founding director of the Harvard Yiddish Players and the Digital Yiddish Theater Project, and she serves on the board of the Yiddish Book Center. So it is a pleasure to welcome today Professor Caplan.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be joining you from New Jersey, all the way to New Mexico and beyond. Let me start by sharing my screen. Okay, great. So today, what I'd like to try to do in about 45 minutes is to do a bit of a crash course in Yiddish theater history, kind of looking at some of the main people, trends, and plays across the history of Yiddish theater. So let's start with the beginnings. Where does Yiddish theater begin, and how does it begin? And it's really an interesting story. Um, Yiddish theater as a professional enterprise, the professional playwrights, professional actors, plays that are being written down, doesn't actually begin until the 1870s in Eastern Europe. And if you know anything about the history of theater and European theater, the 1870s is the point where most European countries have established things like national dramatic academies and have very richly developed theater traditions. So it's really interesting and really kind of specific that Jews in Eastern Europe, Ashkenazic Jews, are really not making professional theater at all until the late 19th century. And the reasons why are interesting and maybe a little bit surprising. So what you're seeing here are two examples of what I would call kind of early proto-Yiddish theater. On the left-hand side, what you see is a badchin, a wedding jester, who is performing a song for the bride during a wedding. And you can see everybody is crying in the room. That was the goal. Wedding jesters, badchins, their job was to sort of be like an MC for the wedding, provide entertainment. They would do a lot of sort of improvised rhyming couplets, and their goal indeed was, generally speaking, to make everybody cry, to remind people about the sort of milestones of life and death, and to sort of bring that emotional focus to the fore. What you see on the right is a group of amateur actors who are getting ready to perform a Purim spiel. And that's where we're going to start today, talking about the history of the Purim spiel, and what that tells us about the history of Jewish theater. So the first thing to know is that it was understood prior to 1876. It was really widely understood in the Jewish world that theater was something that was not allowed, that was forbidden, and somewhat rather strictly so. And this goes all the way back to the Talmud. We also have prohibitions against graven images, which have sometimes been interpreted to have something to do with theater. But I think really the biggest break comes in the Talmud, where we have in Tractate Avodah Zarah, we have these teachings that Jews should not go to theaters or circuses because entertainments are arranged there in honor of the idols. Where such entertainments are given, there is the prohibition of being suspected of idolatrous worship. And where such entertainment is not given, the prohibition is because of being in the seat of scoffers. So, what does this all mean, right? The ancient rabbis really were uncomfortable with the idea of Jews going to theater at all, whether or not the performances were about the idols, right? Whether or not the performances were about polytheism and the gods. The prohibition was really understood to be you don't go to the theater or the circus at all, no matter what the kind of entertainment is. So, what is the sort of context for this? Where the ancient rabbis are writing this kind of against the backdrop of ancient Roman theater, which, first of all, has an awful lot of gods in it. Ancient Greek and Roman theater has a lot to do with gods and religious expression. So there's discomfort around that. But the other thing that happens in ancient Roman theater that the rabbis were pretty uncomfortable with was things that were happening in the Colosseum with gladiators and slaves and, bloody battles where people were actually killed, right, on a stage. This was also what was happening in these theater spaces. The ancient rabbis found this sort of barbaric. There also were many Jews who were kind of caught up in this as slaves who were being forced to compete in ancient Roman theater. So the response of the ancient rabbis was theater is not for Jews. And kind of remarkably, this idea that theater was not for Jews was pretty successful in stopping Jews from attending or creating formal theater, professional theater, for a couple thousand years. So it was sort of wildly successful from the time of these Talmudic prohibitions up until the 1870s at preventing Jews from really engaging in theater. I think the reason that this actually worked is because there was an allowance made in the tradition for Jews to have one chance at theatrical expression every year, and that was on the holiday of Purim. Every culture, every society has its theatrical energy, has its need for performance and theater. There is really no culture in the world that doesn't have a theater tradition. And so I think what the ancient Jewish world sort of created was theater is not allowed at all, except there is one place and time where it is allowed, and it is central to the experience of observing a holiday, and that becomes Purim. So why was Purim a ideal time to allow for theatrical expression? Well, among other things, it's sort of a topsy-turvy holiday. It's a holiday where lots of things that are forbidden the rest of the year are allowed or even encouraged. For example, drinking heavily is not really supposed to be what Jews are doing the rest of the year. But on Purim, it's not only allowed, it's kind of encouraged, right? There's the tradition that one is to get so drunk that you can't tell the difference between Mordecai, the hero of the story, and Haman, the villain, which those things are very far apart. There are prohibitions in Jewish law against dressing in clothing of the opposite gender. But on Purim, that not only is permitted, it also is encouraged and common, right? And that's part of sort of the Purim tradition. So So here is a holiday when people were sort of accustomed to breaking certain kinds of rules and strictures that the rest of the year were seen as important to be bound to. Um, so on this holiday, it becomes a tradition that you can also, in addition to dressing up as somebody else and stop studying and be frivolous, you also could make theater. So people start writing these sort of Purim plays and performing them on Purim. And we don't know quite how old this is. We know that it goes back at least to the 5th century of the Common Era, and is, a major tradition in the Ashkenazic world for well over 1,000 years. Um, so there are a couple of kind of conventions of how these plays tended to work. First of all, like I said, there's no professional infrastructure. There's no theater buildings in the Ashkenazic Jewish world at this time. There are no professional actors or directors or playwrights. Um, so what usually happened was a group of usually young men, usually from like the local yeshiva, uh, would get together and they would write and rehearse a Purim play in secrecy over the course of the year. And then on Purim Day, the actors who were known as Purim spielers, Purim players, would burst into their neighbors' houses and perform the play. And it was almost kind of like a parade. So the actors would burst into one house, the whole town would follow, they'd perform the play, they'd leave, they'd burst into another house, perform the play, the whole town would follow. Typically, the actors would choose the home of one of the wealthier people in town. Number one, it had the most space. But number two, at the end of the performance, the actors, who were usually themselves young and poor yeshiva students, they would remind their hosts that it was customary to give gifts to the poor, shalach manot on Purim, and they would ask for gifts. So the best gifts and the most space came from the houses of the wealthy. Um, the actors would set up shop in the dining room or the living room with the musicians in the corner. Here's another example in somebody's house. And if you were a host household, you'd get the best seats in the house. You'd be sitting at the dining room table or in the comfy seats in the living room. And everyone else, the entire town would crowd in, peering through the windows, hanging off the windowsills to catch the impromptu show. Um, Let me show you a couple. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of kind of excerpts of these, and then we'll look at a video together of what these sort of looked like and felt like. Um, so here's an example of the kind of thing that the actors might close with at the end of their play. Honored host, what's in the house? Hey, get a move on. Bring out the brandy. Open your cupboard. Don't forget honey cake. Hey, time for treats. So if you wanted to get the actors out of your house, you'd have to pay them in treats, right? In money or whatever you had in your house. And that at that point, the actors would leave and they would go to the next house. It's almost like a combination of, I don't know, improvisational theater and trick-or-treating, sort of something that's a little bit of a cross of those two things. Um, this is another excerpt. This is a kind of famous excerpt that was very commonly said at the end of these Purim spiels. Heint is Purim, today is Purim. Morgen is ois, tomorrow it's gone. Git uns a groschen, give us some money. Und warft uns ois, and throw us out. So what were the plays themselves like? They were typically based on stories from the Bible. Obviously, the Purim story was one of the more common options, but it wasn't always the Purim story. Sometimes Purim spielen they drew on other biblical stories with strong dramatic potential. So Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery was a very common choice, very dramatic. Jonah and the whale, David and Goliath, the sacrifice of Isaac, etc. So they would choose the most sort of dramatic theatrical moments from the Tanakh, and they would stage them in front of their impromptu audience. Usually they were partially improvised, written in rhyming couplets with a lot of repetitions like folk songs. The actors, they were not people who had any sort of acting training. Again, these were usually young men kind of doing this on the side, sometimes young women. And it was very much an improvisational kind of impromptu affair. So here's an excerpt from an old Purim spiel about Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers, and here Joseph is beseeching an angel for help. And we can see, I think, both the structure of the rhyming couplets and also the repetition, right? Repetition, I think, makes it easier to learn if you're trying to memorize lines. It also makes it clearer to your audience what's going on. So there's something a little almost folk song-like about the way some of these were written. Um, One of the interesting things about Purimspielen is that it was pretty common for characters from different times and places to be thrown together on the Purim stage. So you might see a Purim play about Joseph and his brothers making references to contemporary events that are happening in the moment that the play is being performed, say the 17th century. It was not uncommon for Purimspielen to include overt references to local rulers while ostensibly mocking biblical ones. So, for example, King Ahasuerus, who is frequently drunk, makes lots of bad judgment calls in the Purim story. It was pretty common for King Ahasuerus, for that character to be dressed in garb that evoked the local king or prince or governor or count or the Tsar, right? So you could be laughing at King Ahasuerus, but also laughing at um, the ineptitude of some local official. Um, Sometimes it was even the rabbis themselves who were mocked. And again, on Purim, that's something that was not only permitted, but somewhat embraced. Um, so I wanted to show you because these are, there's a really different feeling to these than the Purim spiel, and that I think we are most familiar with in the 21st century as modern Jews who maybe see a Purim spiel that's intended largely for children, say at a synagogue, um, often based on musical theater. These are really kind of a different phenomenon, and I want to show you an excerpt from a film. So this film is called Der Purimspieler, the Purim Players. It's a Yiddish film from 1937. But one of the main characters is a Purim player, is a Purimspieler. And there's a whole lot of things that are happening over the course of the story. But the centerpiece of the film, there's this scene where we get to see the Purimspiel in action. So this is a 1937 recreation of what an older Purimspiel might have been like. But of course, for people in 1937, this is what they grew up with. So it's really the best record that we have of what these things used to be like. So let me share that with you. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay, I will warn you the subtitles here they're not perfect, so they're white text on the black background, but unfortunately sometimes the background is a little too bright to be able to see them. But while we watch this, I would really just focus on it's less about what they're saying and more about kind of stylistically what we're observing about what the theatrical conventions were like and what role this theater served in Jewish culture.
Meine liebe Leiden, wir wollen also spielen, ein Spiel beweisen. Achashverosh war Melech HaGroße, Melech HaGroße. Hat lieb gehabt Weiberlich, und ist fein gehabt kein Kreuzer.
Okay, so, uh-oh, okay, let me stop that. So that's just a little bit of a taste, right, of what these Purim Spielen were like. So from the 5th century CE up until the 1870s, what Yiddish theater really was Purim Spielen, and then, other kinds of occasional kind of impromptu performances at functions like weddings. Um, in 1876, that all changed. And the man who was really responsible for that change is a gentleman named Avram Goldfaden. Let me switch us back to here. Okay, so here he is. Um, okay. Avram Goldfaden, who is also known as the father of Yiddish theater. Um, so let me tell you a little bit about the story of Avram Goldfaden, because he's a little bit of an unlikely hero for the father of Yiddish theater role. Avram Goldfaden was born in a relatively assimilated Jewish family in the Russian Empire. He grew up speaking mostly Russian, though of course he also knew Yiddish. And when he was older, he went to a Russian Empire Rabbinical Academy, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, and truly it was. There was a moment in the 1850s and 60s where the Russian government wanted Jews to assimilate, and so they started these rabbinical academies that were run by the state. That were really secular schools teaching Russian and really teaching and pushing assimilation, but they were specifically for Jews. So if you were a young person, you could go to a rabbinical academy, and your parents might think it was the rabbinical academy, but actually, you were studying to sort of assimilate into Russian society. So Goldfaden goes to one of these schools where he's surrounded by other young, assimilated Jewish men. And while he's there, he comes across this strange little closet drama that was written by this other guy named Shlomo Ettinger like 30 years earlier. A closet drama is a play that's not intended to be performed. It is intended just to be read as literature. And in the early 1800s, Jewish writers start experimenting with writing plays, but there is no theatrical infrastructure. There's no theater anything. So these plays are just kind of circulated among intellectuals and occasionally published, but nobody's performing them. Goldfaden stumbles across one of these. He loves it, and he decides that he is going to put on a production of this play at his school. So when he is 16 years old, he puts on this production. He himself plays the title role, and it's a huge success. This is like a formative moment in his adolescence. So he graduates his rabbinical high school, his fake rabbinical high school, and he goes on to try to find a place for himself in the Russian Empire. And he tries to do 5 or 6 different things, and he fails spectacularly at each one. So he tries to start a hat making business. He goes bankrupt. He tries to start a Russian Jewish newspaper. He goes bankrupt again, right? He tries to start another business, a confectionery business. He goes bankrupt again. He tries to get a job in a factory. He can't get a job. Everything he's trying, he's really failing out spectacularly. And so in the 1870s, he shows up in Odessa, looking for whatever his next thing is going to be, having pretty much failed at everything in his life so far. And he's also in a good deal of debt. He comes to Odessa, and he makes his way down to this wine garden. Wine gardens are kind of a big thing in the cultural landscape of Odessa at the moment. You go, you sit, you drink wine. Sometimes people play music. It's a little bit like an open mic night. So he goes to one of these, and he sees people getting up, and sometimes they're sharing poetry and sometimes they're sharing songs. And he thinks to himself, maybe my next big thing is I'm going to be a great Yiddish poet. So he goes home, he writes himself a poem, he comes back to the wine garden the next night, and he gets up in front of the crowd and he starts declaiming his poem out loud. And here's the thing, Avram Goldfaden shows up to this wine garden, which is a little bit kind of divey, right? But he's wearing a top hat, he's wearing tails, he's wearing white gloves. He doesn't belong, he's been sort of hobnobbing with these elitist Russian intellectuals. he's not familiar with sort of the Jewish masses, which is who's at the wine garden. Um, so people, predictably, they take one look at him. They don't really listen to what he's saying. They start booing, they start throwing things. They say, "Get this guy off the stage." Um, but there's one young man named Yisrael Grodner who is listening to the poem. And this young man thinks to himself, "This guy's actually a pretty good writer. We should try to give him a chance." So Yisrael Grodner gets up next to him on the little stage and he says, "Hey, everybody, I think that we should give this guy's poem a chance. Let me read the poem." Grodner reads the poem, and the two of them start reading the poem back and forth, and they start acting it out a little bit, and they start doing some voices, and the crowd goes wild. They love it. And suddenly, every night, Goldfaden and Grodner are getting up on this stage, and they're doing little skits that they're writing together. Grodner really has a knack for humor, and he has a knack for what the masses might find entertaining. And Goldfaden is a good literary writer who doesn't have those other things. So the two of them make a really excellent team. And Goldfaden looks around one day and he says, there's all of these Russian theaters. What if we made a Yiddish theater? So he and Grodner decide, okay, we're going to start a Yiddish theater. And so they do. They start recruiting local actors in Odessa. Again, there are no actors in the Jewish world. This has been strictly prohibited. But they start going and looking for actors. Their first recruit is a young woman named Sophie Karp, who she's been going to the wine garden. She's checking this out, and she decides she loves the theater and she wants to join what they're doing. Sophie goes home to her parents and says, "I'm going to run away with these guys and join the theater." And her parents, she's 16 years old, her parents say, "Absolutely not. You cannot leave home until you get married." So what does she do? She goes, talks to the guys, gets married to Grodner, shows up the next day with her parents, says, "Hey, I'm married, I'm leaving, bye." And they all go off to start a Yiddish theater company. And despite the fact that there's really no professional Yiddish theater up until this point, it is pretty immediately wildly successful. This Yiddish theater troupe starts performing. They are selling tickets like crazy. Goldfaden is successful for the first time in his life at anything. And more importantly, within a year, there are dozens of other theater companies because other people are like, "Oh, wait a second, we could make theater too." So within the space of a year, we go from basically no professional Yiddish theater to throughout the Ashkenazic Jewish world, there are theater troupes that are traveling and popping up kind of everywhere you go. It's a real explosion of theatrical activity. So what were Goldfaden's plays like? They were sort of like musical melodramas. This is a frontispiece for the published version of Die Zwei Kuni Lemmels, the Two Kuni Lemmels, which was one of Goldfaden's very famous plays. It's about a Hasidic man who is sort of a fool, and this man named Kuni Lemmel is betrothed to this young girl named Carolina. Carolina is more modern. She's more assimilated. She speaks German. She does not want this sort of foolish traditional man as her husband. Carolina is in love with this guy named Max, who is also kind of like her. He's assimilated. He speaks German. He's very modern. And Max decides that he's going to dress up and pretend to be Kuni Lemmel so that he can marry Carolina. And the scene that you see here is a very funny scene where the two Kuni Lemmels bump into each other, and the fake Kuni Lemmel convinces Kuni Lemmel. Kuni Lemmel is so sort of hopeless that he's able to be convinced that he's not himself, and he ends up leaving, and then Max can marry Carolina. In the end, the truth all comes out, but in the end, they're able to get married anyway. It's a happy ending. So there's some of these plays that Goldfaden is writing and producing are kind of part and parcel of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. They're sort of pro-modernity, against religious superstition, but also they're kind of musical comedies at the same time. Goldfaden also very famously did a lot of biblical stories as operettas. So one of his famous operettas was Bar Kokhba operetta, which tells the story of the Bar Kokhba revolt. The other one that's sort of really iconic is this show called Shulamis, which is sort of loosely inspired by a Talmudic legend um, about a girl. So here, the plot of the story basically, it's based on this Talmudic legend. Um, this girl named Shulamis is wandering in the desert, and she is about to die of thirst. There's a well that she finds, but there's no bucket. So she decides, I trust God that God will get me out of this. I'm going to climb into the well and drink the water and hope that God will save me somehow. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, this young man appears, also handsome, and he rescues her from the well. And they make a solemn promise that they will be married. But there are no witnesses because they're in the middle of the desert. So they promise that they will be married and true to each other in front of the well itself, and a weasel that is in the desert. In the show, it becomes a wildcat, but there's no human witnesses to this. Um, the young man goes off to the city by himself. They separate. He says he'll come back for her. When he goes to the city, he forgets all about her. He gets so caught up in the city and the city life, he falls in love with this other woman who he marries, and forgets his promise. But when he and this other woman have children, the first child drowns in a well, and the second child is mauled to death by a wildcat. And after that happens, the young man remembers his promise and leaves his grieving wife and goes back to Shulamis and marries her. And it's a happy ending, sort of. But it's a sort of parable that's understood very often to be about the relationship of God to the Jewish people, right? That there's a promise that was made, and that we can't forget that promise, or bad things will happen. So this show, this operetta that Goldfaden wrote, was wildly successful, and one of the most famous parts of it is a song called Rozenkes mit Mandlin, Raisins and Almonds, which is a song that I would bet that many people in this Zoom room have heard and know. It became an iconic, maybe even the iconic Yiddish lullaby, but it was from a theater show. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you an excerpt from this show. This is from a production that I adapted and directed, a bilingual Yiddish-English production in 2009. And this was with student actors at Harvard University. So you can get a sense of how this is structured. I think the key point here is that the attention, I think, in these kinds of pieces from the late 1800s, it's focused on beautiful music and beautiful theatricality. Plot structure sometimes is a little besides the point. So in this sequence, we're going to see Avshalom, the young man, just suddenly is like, oh, what is there to eat? Oh, look, raisins and almonds. That reminds me of a song. So Goldfaden wrote this song, Raisins and Almonds. He wanted it to go in the show somewhere. It doesn't fit. It doesn't do anything to tell anything about the story. It's also very anachronistic. It talks about railroads and all sorts of other things that don't belong in the biblical time period. But, suspension of disbelief here, Goldfaden doesn't really care. He just sticks it in the play. So it's not quite like musical theater where the songs are advancing the plot, but sometimes the songs are just there for entertainment. So let's take a look at that sequence. Okay, let's go back a little bit. We can see Shulamis go into the well. This is the young man's companion, who is half goat, half human.
It's good! the guitar? What do you say? Oh, you see, I'm right. I always know my way. You said there was a well and I was right. Now undo the pack. What have we got to bite?
Oh, we got the raisins, we got almonds, and good meal, let me tell you.
What about figs? Meh.
Nah.
In goat-herd days, you fed your hungry flocks. I'm hungry now, and out beyond those rocks are many trees with branches and twigs. So go, you goat, and fetch me some fresh figs.
But we got the raisins. We got almonds, a nice meal, and helps with the bow.
Go quickly.
All right. Quickly go.
Till I've had a rest, I'm not leaving this spot. Jerusalem's still far, and the day is so hot. Raisins and almonds make a tasty treat. There's water. What more do I need? Raisins and almonds. That reminds me of a song so sweet, with which Zion's daughter sang her little son to sleep.
In dem Beis Hamikdash, in Avin Kochele, siehst die Amone bat Zion allein. Ihr ben Yochid Olidele, winzig Seder, und senkt ihn zum Schlafen
So we'll stop there. Just a little excerpt from this Goldfaden piece from my version in 2009. Um, so, okay, moving forward a little bit because we're doing kind of a crash course in Yiddish theater history here. So in the 1870s, theater is thriving in Eastern Europe. Yiddish theater is thriving. There are dozens and dozens of troops. It's suddenly almost overnight a massive industry with thousands of people involved. However, things are changing in the Russian Empire, and they're changing in ways that are about to make things a lot more difficult than Jews. So 1876, Goldfaden starts with Yiddish theater. 1881, just a few years later, Tsar Alexander II is assassinated in Russia, and the Russian government decides to blame this on the Jews. This is sort of an internal government thing that's going on. The assassin is not Jewish, but they decide to blame it on the Jews because it's a politically expedient way to direct the blame elsewhere outside of this more repressive government that is coming in. So this is when pogroms start in the Russian Empire in 1881. And they're really, really quite violent. The 1905 pogrom in Odessa, 2,500 Jews died. So this is not like the same thing as what we see maybe on the stage in Fiddler on the Roof, where a pogrom happens and they smash some things and they rip open some pillowcases. But typically these were really violent affairs that left a lot of people dead and severely wounded. They were really, really terrifying. So beginning in 1881, we have mass immigration from the Russian Empire, from Eastern Europe to the United States. Um, Also in the 1880s, alongside all of the repression and pogroms, in 1883, the Russian government also outlaws Yiddish theater. So just, less than 10 years after this starts, now we have all of this theatrical energy, all of these playwrights and actors and theater companies, and suddenly it is illegal for them to perform at home. So between 1881 and 1910, 1.5 million Jews came to the US from Eastern Europe, including probably many ancestors of people in this room. But among those 1.5 million were an awful lot of actors and theater people because, again, Yiddish theater became completely illegal back home. So there was a real impulse for people interested in theater to leave the Russian Empire all of a sudden. So we have mass immigration to the US, many, many, many theater people settling primarily in New York, establishing a Yiddish press, establishing also a Yiddish theater. In 1881, one of the thousands of immigrants who comes to New York City is a 12-year-old boy named Boris Tomaszewski. Boris got two jobs. He comes by himself, 12 years old. He gets two jobs. By day, he's working as a cigarette maker in a sweatshop factory. And at night, he earns extra cash by singing in synagogues. He had a really beautiful voice. In the sweatshop, making cigarettes, he makes friends with another teenage immigrant. And this other young boy, also like 12, 13 years old, this other young boy really misses his brothers. And his brothers are actors back in Europe. They wanted to come with him to America, but the family could only afford one ticket. So they sent the youngest son. So Tomaszewski's sitting in the factory. He's talking to his friend who has some actor brothers who really want to come to the US. He notices that people in the sweatshop to pass the time, they're singing songs from the Yiddish theater. And he decides, I'm going to be the entrepreneur and I'm going to start a Yiddish theater in America because there wasn't any yet. This is 1881. So Tomaszewski, at 12 years old, he raises money to bring his friends' actor brothers over and recruits a bunch of other actors to make a theater troupe. He convinced a local tavern owner to help pay the fare and to help them rent a hall for the theater. And then he starts putting up posters all around New York City announcing the performance. And this huge population of recently displaced Jews who is missing the theater back home turns out in droves for this performance. By the way, Tomaszewski, right, by the time he's 12 when this all starts, he's 13 when the first performance happens. He becomes the producer and the director of this company. He's aware that he has no actor training, but he has dreams of being an actor. So on opening night, he bribes one of the actors to fake a sore throat so that he can go on in their place and he becomes the lead in the show. And once he does this, everybody loves the show. And now Boris Tomaszewski is an extremely famous Yiddish actor running a theater company as a teenager. The first play that they do is, of course, a Goldfaden play because Goldfaden is the father of Yiddish theater. It's what everybody knows. Huge success. Tomaszewski takes his company on the road, performing mostly Goldfaden's plays. They go kind of in a circuit, New York, Philly, Baltimore, DC, Chicago, Boston. They're constantly getting an influx of hugely talented actors, the best of the best, because when Russian theater is banned in the Russian Empire, every Yiddish actor worth anything is coming as fast as they can to get out and go to London or the US. And on the road, Tomaszewski meets and falls in love with a 14-year-old girl named Bessie. Bessie sees Tomaszewski performing in one of his plays. She falls immediately in love, and they decide that they're going to get married. So here they are in their engagement photo. At this point, Boris is 20 and Bessie is 14. And she becomes part of his company as well. There's a wonderful, Michael Tilson Thomas, the famous conductor, has a wonderful program about his grandparents. His grandparents were Boris and Bessie Tomaszewski, and it's called The Tomaszewskis. It was like recorded as a PBS Great Works performance. It's wonderful if anybody ever is interested in this. There's so much to say about these figures and what they did and their wild stories. But for the sake of time, we'll have to leave them here for now. Okay. So between 1890 and 1940, there are over 200 Yiddish theater companies in the United States. It's a really, really, really massive enterprise. It's a massive industry. In 1918, in New York City alone, there are 20 Yiddish theaters that are performing 8, 9 shows a week, right? So if we think about it in relation to, say, Broadway today, Broadway has 44 theaters. So if you look at what's happening on Broadway, it's roughly 40 at any given time that are in performance. Yiddish theater in New York wasn't quite that size, but it was up there. It was like half that size, which is pretty significant. It was a really, really big thing. And we don't always have numbers about audience, but one of the statistics I really like is that in 1937, in that season, we know that 1.75 million tickets to Yiddish theater were sold in New York City, which, if you do the math on that, it means if we divide that by the number of Yiddish speaking adults in the city, it would mean that every adult in the city saw 3 shows a year, which is pretty impressive. Every Yiddish speaking adult in New York City. So we had all of these Yiddish theater companies in the United States, which quickly kind of becomes the locus and the focus of Yiddish theater and around the world. And they are performing mostly what the public really likes. So the public really enjoys, I would say, the same kind of thing, musical melodramas. Here we have a Tomaszewski show called Das Pintel Yid, The Little Spark of Jewishness, about sort of Jewishness shining on through the darkness. Here we have a musical comedy, Der Meshuggner, The Lunatic, right? And one thing that starts happening in New York as well is that we get these sort of purpose-built Yiddish theaters centered around Second Avenue that are really massive in size and scope. And again, I think people sometimes forget how big this is. But to put it in perspective, some of these theaters, they seat 2,000 people and they're full 8, 9 shows a week, every single night, full of audiences who love Yiddish theater. It's really something that people are habitually going to, not just in New York City, but all across the US and also all across the world. So despite the fact that there was a ban in the Russian Empire, Yiddish theater does manage to still survive and kind of eke out an existence. And once the ban is removed in 1905, Yiddish theater comes back in Eastern Europe with full force. And it really emerges that there are a few centers of Yiddish theater. New York is one of them. Warsaw is also one of them. And then at a certain point, Vilna kind of takes over and becomes an important center as well. So we don't have a lot of time. I think what I'll do is just kind of show you a couple of things about the Dybbuk and say a little bit about that. And then I want to leave some time for questions. So let's just go forward a little bit here. So the Vilna Troupe was one of a number of Yiddish theater companies across the world that was interested in taking the melodrama out of Yiddish theater and making it more literary and sophisticated. Their most famous play was the Dybbuk, which I understand that some of you will be seeing soon through this program. And the Dybbuk is it's an interesting kind of unusual play because it's about spiritual possession. It's really sort of mystical and magical. It's about a young woman, Leah, who's on the right here, who is possessed by the spirit of her dead lover, Ronen. And ultimately, they are only able to truly reunite in death. This play becomes really an absolute overnight sensation, not just in the Jewish world, but also outside of it. That is the author right there, Shin Ansky. When he first writes the play, people think it's totally not theatrical and can't really be produced. But Ansky keeps writing it, and eventually this young group of people called the Vilna Troupe, they show up and they say, "We want to do your play," and they turn it into this sort of massive global sensation. The play is really deeply entangled with Jewish ethnography and religious ideas, and somewhat of an unlikely candidate for to be really successful among audiences who don't speak Yiddish. But I think one of the things that's really kind of remarkable about the Dybbuk is that from its earliest productions, um, it's popular with everybody, and very, very popular with audiences who don't speak Yiddish, who I think see this play as a way to maybe understand more about the Jews who are their neighbors. Um, when the Dybbuk is first performed in 1920, it's a huge sensation. The press calls it Dybbuk mania, and it really spreads kind of all over the world. And I guess the last thing I'll say about that, and I'm happy to answer some questions, is that this production of the Dybbuk sparks many more productions to this day. There's really not a year that goes by without the Dybbuk being produced somewhere. Here's a Dybbuk production in New York just about that same year, inspired by the Vilna Troupe production. So Yiddish theater is happening in lots of different places, but people are very much in communication with each other. And a lot of times the same repertoire is happening across the world. Um, this is the famous Moscow production by Habima, which becomes its own kind of sensation, this very expressionist production that Habima does. Um, and then, there's a million other versions. There's a George Gershwin version of the Dybbuk as an opera. There's a Leonard Bernstein and Jerome Robbins Dybbuk ballet. Um, and today there's more, right? There's a Tony Kushner Dybbuk. There's there are lots of Dybbuks that are actually, I would say, most popular today in Poland and Germany. So here are some of those, kind of with really interesting different theatrical ways of depicting the Dybbuk possession. And then I'll just land with this. This is I find this really interesting. This is kind of an immersive, experimental, Dybbuk-inspired production where audience members wandered through this old hospital, and each room had different sort of scenes from the Dybbuk. And here we have somebody who is playing the part of Chonin, the young male lover. But what the actor is doing is carving Hebrew letters out of beets, and then using the beets to stain fabric to create lines from the play that then get kind of hung up in the background. It's a really beautiful, interesting artistic piece. I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure that there is time for questions.
We have some questions popping up. David Schulman asks, "It's great to see someone from Baruch College. I have a long affiliation," so he's just glad to be connected.
That's wonderful.
Diane Katz, my great aunt Rosetta Biales was an actress in Yiddish theater in New York City. I've tried researching her career, but haven't gotten very far. How can I learn about Aunt Rosita's career?
That's a great question. I think there are two things I would recommend. One is there's a book. So the challenge is in Yiddish, but there is a book called The Lexicon of Yiddish Theater that where actors are listed by name, and it has information about each actor. Not every actor in the Yiddish theater is part of it, but that might be a place to look in the index and see if her name might be there, because if so, there would be some information. Um, the the other thing I would suggest, the lexicon, and it'll come back to me. Hold on one second. There was something else I was going to suggest, but I can't think of what it was right now. I mean, you could always reach out to the Center for Jewish History in New York and ask the archivists there, because they sometimes are really able to answer questions like that.
Don Goldstein asks, do any of the venues of Yiddish theater in New York still exist? And are they commemorated by plaques or way to find them? Yeah.
a great question. Most of them don't exist. I mean, also many of the buildings just get repurposed. There's so many of them have been turned into, banks and whatnot. There's only really two things that you can see, and one is a maybe. So there is one theater on, I want to say 14th Street, that was it's the former Yiddish Art Theater building that was turned into a movie theater, and that movie theater is still very much in operation. There is a plaque. You can go and see a movie there. Of course, they've changed things in the building to make it a movie theater, but you get a little bit of the feeling of the space. There's also the Yiddish Actors Union building. The first actors union in the US was the Yiddish Actors Union. Equity actually based themselves on the Yiddish Actors Union. So Actors Equity comes from the Yiddish theater. But that building is closed to the public. Sometimes people can take a tour. There's a group of people that are trying to turn it into a museum. Maybe someday it could be. But that's a space that has an incredible amount of Yiddish theater kind of knowledge in its bones. Just it's not open for people to really see right now. Oh, and the last thing I would say is there's a Yiddish Theater Walk of Fame down on Second Avenue. It's in front of a TD Bank. It's where a Yiddish theater used to be, but it's in the sidewalk, kind of like the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And you can see the names of Yiddish actors and their dates and some information that's kind of in plaques in the sidewalk as a Walk of Fame.
Robert Davidson asked if there's a history of theater in the Sephardi world that's comparable to this.
It's a great question. It's not something that I am at all an expert on. I will start with that. Yes, and I think it's not comparable. Like it's a different tradition. I think it's more of an oral tradition than a written tradition, and not as large in terms of like the number of plays, theaters, etc. But certainly there's much to be said about theater in the Sephardic world. It's just something that I don't know as much about.
If I could comment one thing, I know it was very well developed in the Ottoman Empire. So with Ladino in Istanbul, there was a significant Sephardi theater movement. Um, but I mean that would be a place to start, at least, you know. Lincoln Snyder asks, as a Yiddish language learner, where's the best place to start in accessing authentic theater, video or scripts or whatever? That would be not too difficult to follow. Yeah.
I think the best thing to do is the National Center for Jewish Film has been restoring for a long time Yiddish films with subtitles. Most of the subtitles are in better shape than some of what we saw, honestly. But I think that watching Yiddish films from the 1930s with the subtitles is helpful. I also think that you may find it's challenging in terms of there are different dialects at play, and that may be harder to navigate at first. But I do think that is kind of the best place to look.
Gloria Bellavalan asks, would you say the theater is helping in the revival of Yiddish? And as part of that,
Great question.
might add the presentation of Tevye and
Yes.
the Roof in Yiddish, you know. Was,
I
was
mean, I certainly think that
I,
raised a lot of visibility. Yes, yes. The Volksbühne production of Fiddler in Yiddish was wildly successful, beyond I think anybody's expectations, and I think that really um, established a bit of a hunger for more. I think that and Indecent, the play by Paula Vogel, which has also been very, very successful, have really built up a lot of interest in Yiddish theater that is new in terms of what might be seen on the stage. So yes, I think so, and I think that anything that sort of raises, theater's public, it's visible. Raising the profile of Yiddish certainly helps.
and could you speak just a little bit about your current project, working on a play that has the,
Sure.
yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And maybe I'll see if I can pull something up to show you as well. So I'm working on a new musical that is inspired by true stories about people who were part of the Paper Brigade in the Vilna Ghetto. The Paper Brigade was a group of people. Let's get it pulled up. The Paper Brigade was a group of people who they were conscripted by the Nazis to catalog Jewish books for Nazi purposes, for sort of fake academic purposes, ultimately, to create propaganda and to create a museum of an extinct people. And these scholars and artists and writers, they could not do that and just go ahead and do that. So they spent a year and a half smuggling millions of pages of books, and they successfully really saved a massive archive of um, of Yiddish literature and culture, which is a large part of why we know so much about Yiddish literature and culture today. So these people were kind of incredible heroes. But it's complicated because after the war, the few who survived from this group, they emerged into a world where the Soviet Union did not want the books to be preserved for their own reasons, right? They emerged into a moment where now there's new players with new kinds of anti-Semitism at play. So the books really get stuck. They get stuck in the Soviet Union, and our main character spends most of her life thinking that everything she did was for nothing. And it's not till she's in her 80s, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, that she's able to see that actually she did save a culture. But she spends a lot of her life thinking, nobody even cares about these books and they're rotting underground. So I'll just show you, um, where is it? Okay. I think you can see that. So yeah, so this is it's a new musical in development. We're hoping to have a reading in New York in February. But if you're curious to know more about this, we did release an EP of music in August. So these are 3 songs from the show that kind of give you a taste of what the show sounds like and what it's about. And you can find it on Spotify or Apple Music or anywhere you stream music. So yeah, it's very much in development and a project I'm very, very excited about.
All the best to you in this new project. And Professor Caplan, we thank you so much for being with the Distinguished Lecture Series today and bringing us this very comprehensive overview of Yiddish theater. And we congratulate you on your work and all the best to you as you go forward.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This was really nice.